Dean Martin leaned over the Steinway with the ease of a man who had never once been wrong about anything. Or so he believed. His tuxedo was flawless. His voice, when he spoke, carried the soft certainty that powerful men always use when they want to say something permanent without raising their tone. "Elvis," he said. The name came out slow, almost kind. "You're a hell of an entertainer. But jazz piano..." He let a half-smile settle across his face like a verdict already delivered. "That's not your world, son." 300 people in the NBC Burbank studio went completely still. Johnny Carson, seated behind his desk just 10 feet away, pressed both hands flat against the wood and did not speak. He had spent 15 years on live television, learning to read a room. He read this one in an instant. Something had just been said that could not be unsaid. Elvis Presley did not answer. He sat at the piano bench with both hands resting on the keys, and he looked at the instrument the way a man looks at something he has known longer and more honestly than most people in his life. The studio lights burned overhead. The cameras were rolling. Millions of Americans watched from their living rooms on a cold December night in 1968, and Elvis said nothing at all. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. In that room, it felt like much longer. What not one person in that studio understood, not Dean, not Carson, not anyone in those 300 seats, was that the man at that piano had been playing jazz since before rock and roll had a name. For 22 years, he had kept it entirely to himself. Stay right with us, because what happened next in that studio in December 1968 didn't just silence the room. It shattered the one man in Hollywood who was never supposed to break. The Tonight Show stage on the night of December 3rd, 1968, was not supposed to become anything more than good television. NBC had booked Dean Martin as a guest commentator. Elvis Presley was there to perform 2 songs from his upcoming special. Johnny Carson was there to do what he always did, hold the room together with that easy, unreadable Midwestern composure that made every guest feel both comfortable and slightly off balance at the same time. The producers had a schedule. The band had a set list. Everything had been arranged. But arrangements have a way of falling apart when you put certain men in the same room. Dean Martin, at 51 years old, was something America had decided it understood completely. The loose grin, the glass in the hand, the voice that moved through a standard the way water moves through a familiar channel, without effort, without error, without anything that looked like work. He had built that image across 3 decades, and he wore the way men wear things they have carried so long they no longer feel the weight. What people missed, looking at the eaves, was the architecture underneath it. Dean had studied music formally. He knew theory. He knew jazz. He had strong opinions about what the word musicianship actually meant, and he did not extend those opinions generously toward rock and roll. He had said in interviews more than once that the music of the new generation was entertainment dressed up as art. He had said it pleasantly, the way he said most things, but he had meant every word. Elvis Presley, at 33, was in the middle of the most complicated year of his professional life. The Hollywood decade had cost him something. 5 years of lightweight films, forgettable soundtracks, and carefully managed appearances had created a distance between Elvis and the thing that had made him essential in the first place. The critics had started using a word he could feel even when he didn't read the reviews. Irrelevant. His 68 comeback special had just aired, and the hunger was back in his eyes, visible and raw and unmistakable. But the question hanging over him in every room he walked into was whether the hunger was enough, whether what he had was real, whether it had always been real, or whether it had been image all the way down. Dean Martin, in the way of men who have spent their lives certain of their own judgment, had already answered that question to his own satisfaction. He was about to find out how wrong a certain man can be. What Dean Martin did not know, what nobody in Hollywood had ever looked closely enough to discover, had its beginning not in a recording studio, not on a concert stage, but in a small white church on Adams Street in Tupelo, Mississippi, in the autumn of 1946. Elvis Presley was 11 years old. The First Assembly of God Church had a battered upright piano near the front wall, its finish worn to bare along the bass keys from decades of Sunday mornings. The congregation sang with their entire bodies, the music and the worship not 2 separate things but completely the same thing. And every week, Sitting in the third pew with his mother Gladys beside him, Elvis watched the church pianist the way most boys his age watched nobody, and nothing with that kind of attention. Brother Claude Gentry was 63 years old, a former juke joint musician turned gospel pianist who had spent 30 years converting the same chord language, jazz, blues, the deep harmonic vocabulary of American music, into Sunday morning worship. He noticed the Presley boy the way musicians notice children who have stopped pretending to listen and started actually hearing. After service one Sunday in September, he asked Elvis to stay behind. What followed was 3 years of Sunday afternoons in that church, just the two of them and the old upright piano. No sheet music, no formal lesson structure, only the music itself. How the left hand builds a foundation that the right hand then builds a home on top of. How gospel piano is jazz piano with its shoes off. How the same chord can mean entirely different things depending on what surrounds it and who is playing it and what they're carrying when they sit down. By the time Elvis was 14, he could move through any chord sequence placed in front of him and find a melody living inside the harmony. By 15, he was playing stride patterns with his left hand that most trained pianists spent years trying to develop. The blues inflection was in his hands the way it gets into hands, only through years of practice that begins before the player is old enough to understand what they are building. He never spoke about it. When Sun Records and Sam Phillips and rock and roll arrived, the image that formed around Elvis had no room in it for Sunday afternoons in Tupelo or the old church pianist who had given him a foundation that nobody in the music industry ever knew to look for. The image was the lightning bolt, the hips, the sneer, the electricity. That was the story people wanted, and that was the story they were given. The piano in the back room belonged to Elvis alone. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Because the moment those 22 years of silence finally walked out into the light of that NBC studio is one of the most stunning things that has ever happened on live American television. Elvis reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed his rings. 2 gold bands and a diamond. He set them on the closed lid of the Steinway one at a time, with a quiet, deliberate sound that the nearest microphone caught and carried. Then he adjusted the piano bench, settled his posture, and placed both hands above the keys. He did not look at Dean Martin. He did not look at Johnny Carson. He did not look at the 300 people sitting in that studio in absolute silence. He looked at the piano the way Brother Claude Gentry had taught him to look at it 32 years earlier in a small church in Tupelo, as a conversation, not a performance, as something you enter, not something you present. Then he began to play. The first thing the room heard was not rock and roll. It was not the sound anyone in that studio had prepared themselves to hear from Elvis Presley. His left hand found a walking jazz bass line, the kind of line that moves through chord changes the way a man walks through a house he has lived in for decades, finding every doorway in the dark without reaching for a wall. His right hand followed, not immediately, but with intention, a jazz melody, clean and unhurried and deeply schooled, rising above the bass line with the confidence of something that had been practiced not for weeks, but for years. Johnny Carson's bandleader, Doc Severinsen, was standing in the left wing with a clear sight line to the piano. He took one step forward. Then he stopped completely. He would say afterward that he stopped because he was afraid that if he moved, something would end, something he hadn't known was happening until it was already happening. Dean Martin's arms would have been folded across his chest with composed authority of a man observing something he expected to see fail, came unfolded at the 90-second mark. Not dramatically, not with any visible decision behind it. They simply came apart, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Elvis's hands, and something in his face that had nothing professional left in it. 3 minutes in, Elvis shifted. The jazz structure remained, the left hand still walking, the harmonic language still precise and deeply felt, but something older entered the right hand, something with Mississippi clay in it. Gospel. The chord voicings opened up and the melody began to breathe differently, the way a person breathes differently when they stop performing and start remembering. The 2 languages, the jazz of the juke joint and the gospel of the Sunday church, were not competing. They were finishing each other's sentences. It became clear to everyone listening, the same language spoken from 2 different directions toward the same center. At the 8-minute mark, Johnny Carson's floor director moved to signal a commercial break. Carson looked at him once and gave the smallest shake of his head. The cameras kept rolling. By the 10th minute, 3 musicians sitting in the studio audience had stopped looking at Elvis's face and were watching only his left hand, the way specialists watch the thing that tells them what they are actually dealing with. A session pianist in the 4th row leaned forward until his elbows were on his knees and stayed that way without moving. At 12 minutes, Elvis played a final chord. He let it decay completely. He let the room hold the silence that followed it the way a room holds something it is not ready to release. And then the silence broke, not into applause, but into something louder and less organized than applause. Something closer to the sound a room makes when 300 people exhale at exactly the same moment. Dean Martin had not moved from the spot where he had stood since the 90-second mark. His eyes were wet. He made no effort to conceal it. There was, in that moment, no version of Dean Martin left in that room who would have thought to try. Johnny Carson had interviewed every significant figure in American entertainment across 15 years of live television. He had sat across from presidents and poets and the most carefully managed celebrities the industry had ever produced. He knew how to move a moment forward. He knew how to give a guest the space to say something meaningful without letting the silence become uncomfortable for the audience at home. It was a precise skill that had made him the most trusted man in American living rooms for a generation. He did not use that skill now. He sat behind his desk, and he let the silence stand. For 5 full seconds, with the cameras live and 300 people watching and millions more watching at home, Johnny Carson said absolutely nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice had the quality. It only carried on the rare occasions when something had happened on his stage that he had not anticipated and could not contain inside his usual composure. "Dean," he said quietly, "I think the floor is yours." Dean Martin walked across the studio toward the piano. He walked slowly, not with performance in his steps, but with the particular deliberateness of a man who is organizing something inside himself while his body moves. He stopped in front of Elvis. He looked at him for a moment without speaking. When the words came, they came without the famous ease, without the looseness that 30 years of practice cool had made second nature. What came instead was something rarer and more costly. "I have been saying for 15 years that what you do isn't music," Dean said. His voice was low enough that Carson leaned slightly forward at his desk to catch it. "I said it in print. I said it on stages. I said it to people in this industry whose opinions shaped how your work was received. I was protecting a definition that I had decided was the right one, and I was wrong, not around the edges, not in the details. Fundamentally wrong about you and about what I was actually listening to every time I chose not to listen." He paused. Something moved across his face that the studio audience recognized but could not name. It was the expression of a man making a genuine accounting of himself in public, which is one of the rarest things a powerful person can do. "I owe you better than what I gave you tonight, before you played. And I owe you better than what I have said about you for a long time." Elvis looked at him for a moment. Then he said, simply and without drama, "You didn't know what you didn't know, Dean. Neither did I for a long time." Carson wrote 4 words in the margin of his notes that night, pressing hard enough that the impression stayed in the paper for years afterward. The words were, he finally told someone, "Hit that like button right now and subscribe." Because what those 4 words meant, and the one person they were really written about, is the part of the story that has never been told until now. Gladys Love Presley died on August 14, 1958. She was 46 years old. Elvis was 23. He did not perform for 8 weeks after. The people closest to him during that period said he was not grieving the way that people grieve when they lose someone they love. He was something else entirely, broken in a way that did not have a word that fitted cleanly. What very few people knew, what even Vernon Presley spoke about only once, in a private conversation years later, was what Gladys had said to her son in the living room of the Tupelo house in the autumn of 1946, the week after Elvis came home from his first Sunday afternoon alone with Brother Claude Gentry at the church piano. Elvis had sat down at the neighbor's upright, borrowed for 30 minutes every Tuesday, and played the chord progression Brother Claude had shown him that Sunday. He played it slowly and then faster and then slowly again. He did not know his mother was standing in the doorway behind him. He did not know she had been there for several minutes, listening without moving, her hand resting against the door frame. When he finished, she said, "That's what you sound like inside, baby. That's the real sound." He never forgot it. Not through Sun Records. Not through Ed Sullivan. Not through 5 years of Hollywood. Not through any of it. The jazz gospel language that came out of his hands in that NBC studio on December 3rd, 1968. The thing that unfolded Dean Martin and silenced Doc Severinsen and put 4 words in Carson's notebook, had its first and only intended audience in a Tupelo doorway in 1946. A woman in a house dress, listening without speaking, already knowing. That night, after the broadcast ended and the studio had emptied, Elvis called his father from a phone in the NBC building. His voice, when Vernon answered, was quiet and not quite steady. "I played for Mama tonight, Daddy," he said. "I finally played what she always heard." Vernon did not answer for a long moment. When he did, his voice was the same. Dean Martin never spoke about that night in any interview. Not once. He did not reference it in the profile pieces that ran through the 70s. He did not mention it in the conversations that were later reconstructed by the people closest to him. He had built a life around the principle that a man of a particular kind of cool did not publicly revisit his own failures. That principle held, with one exception. His daughter, Deanna, in a private conversation she has recalled only rarely, asked him once what he considered the most humbling moment of his professional life. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then he said, "A kid from Tupelo sat down at a piano in Burbank and played something so honest it made me ashamed of every certain thing I had ever said. And the worst part was that he didn't do it to prove anything. He did it because the music was already in him, had been in him the whole time. I just never thought to look." Elvis Presley never spoke publicly about what he played that night or why. When journalists asked, he redirected the conversation. The piano in the Graceland Music Room stayed polished and largely private. Some things, in his understanding, were not for explaining. They were for playing, alone, at 2 a.m, in a quiet house, with no audience and no cameras and no verdict being delivered by anyone. Just the music, the way it had always been, the way Gladys had always known. Subscribe, because the greatest stories are always the ones nobody thought to tell.